He should have died twice. By every law of physics, by every calculation of probability, by every grim statistic that history has ever recorded about the most destructive weapons ever unleashed upon human beings, he should not be alive. And yet Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived. He survived not one but two atomic bomb detonations. He stood inside the kill zone of Hiroshima, and then 3 days later he stood inside the kill zone of Nagasaki. 2 cities, 2 bombs. Two moments when the sky cracked open and the world learned what true annihilation looked like. And through both of them, this one quiet, ordinary Japanese engineer walked out breathing. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about miracles, though you will be tempted to call it that. This is a story about one man moving through the absolute worst moments in human history, and somehow impossibly, heartbreakingly, stubbornly, surviving them both. To understand what Tsutomu Yamaguchi endured, you have to understand what the world looked like in the summer of 1945. The Second World War had been grinding for 6 years. Tens of millions were already dead. Europe was in ruins. The Pacific was a theater of unrelenting brutality, island by island, beach by beach, body by body. Japan had been fighting since 1931, first in Manchuria, then across Asia, then against the full industrial and military might of the United States. By the summer of 1945, Japan itself was under siege. American bombers had been firebombing Japanese cities for months. Tokyo had been reduced to ash, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya all burning. The Japanese civilian population was starving, exhausted, terrified. And yet the Japanese military government refused to surrender. They spoke of fighting to the last man, woman, and child. They trained civilians with bamboo spears. They prepared for a ground invasion that military planners estimated could cost 1 million American lives and untold millions of Japanese ones. The world was hurtling toward something catastrophic, and nobody on the ground could see how it would end. Into this world, on an ordinary Monday morning in early August 1945, stepped Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He was 29 years old. He was a naval engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the kind of quiet, serious, dedicated company man that post-war Japan would later be built upon. He had been sent to Hiroshima on a 3-month business trip to help design a new oil tanker. He had a wife back home. He had a baby daughter. He was not a soldier. He was not a general or a politician or someone who made the decisions that led the world to this moment. He was just a man doing his job, waiting to go home. On August 5, 1945, Yamaguchi finished his work in Hiroshima and was preparing to leave. The next morning he would board a train and return to his family. He had spent 3 months in this city, had come to know its streets, its rhythms, its early morning stillness. On the morning of August 6, he rose early, gathered his things, and began making his way toward the train station. It was a warm summer morning, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as extraordinary. The air was still, the city was waking up, people were heading to work, to school, to the markets, streetcars hummed along their tracks, children walked in small clusters through the streets. It was, by all appearances, just another morning. At 8:15 a.m., Tsutomu Yamaguchi was walking near the Mitsubishi shipyard in Hiroshima, about 3 kilometers from the epicenter of what was about to happen. He later recalled that he heard the distant drone of an American B-29 bomber. This was not unusual. American planes had been appearing in Japanese skies for months. Sometimes they dropped bombs, sometimes they dropped leaflets warning of attacks, sometimes they flew on. People had grown accustomed, in the terrible way that humans grow accustomed to danger, to looking up and waiting. Yamaguchi looked up. He saw the plane, he saw something falling from it. He saw, far above him, a small parachute drifting down through the blue August sky, and then the world ended. There is no clean way to describe what an atomic bomb does to a city. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima that morning, nicknamed Little Boy by the men who dropped it, detonated approximately 600 meters above the ground. In a fraction of a second, it released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. The temperature at the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees Celsius. A fireball erupted. A shockwave expanded outward at the speed of sound, shattering every structure for kilometers in every direction. A thermal pulse radiated outward, burning everything it touched. Within a radius of roughly 1.6 kilometers from the epicenter, almost nothing survived. Buildings evaporated, people evaporated. The city of Hiroshima, with a population of over 300,000 people, was transformed in an instant into a landscape of fire and ash and ruin. Yamaguchi, standing roughly 3 kilometers away, was close enough to be thrown to the ground by the shockwave. The flash of light hit him first, a blinding, searing white that he later described as being like the light of a giant magnesium flare, a light beyond anything he had ever seen. He dove to the ground instinctively, pressing himself into the earth. The blast wave hit him and flung him into the air, spinning him, throwing him into a potato field nearby. His eardrums ruptured. The left side of his body was burned. His arms were scorched. His hair was gone. He lay in the field, dazed, barely conscious, his body registering the damage but his mind not yet fully able to process what had just happened. Around him, the city was already burning. The sky had turned black. A column of smoke and fire was rising into the heavens in a shape that no one who saw it would ever forget, the shape that would become the most haunting symbol of the 20th century. Yamaguchi dragged himself to his feet. He made his way toward the city, toward colleagues, toward whatever shelter could be found. What he walked through was a vision from the deepest circle of hell. The streets were full of people moving like ghosts, silent and staggering, their skin hanging from their bodies in gray sheets, their eyes vacant, some of them already dying, some of them simply too damaged to understand yet that they were dying. Buildings had been flattened or were on fire. Every glass window in the city had shattered. Every wooden structure had been smashed or incinerated. People called out for water. People sat motionless in the rubble, too broken to move. Yamaguchi himself, badly burned, made his way to a bomb shelter and spent that night in darkness, in shock and pain, surrounded by the dying and the dead. Hiroshima, a city of hundreds of thousands of living human beings, had been effectively erased from the earth in the space of a single morning. And yet, against everything, Yamaguchi survived the night. He found two colleagues from Mitsubishi the next day, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sa, who had also been in the city and also survived the blast. Together, the three men made their way out of the ruined city. They walked through streets that were unrecognizable, past landmarks that no longer existed. They crossed bridges over rivers that were clogged with the dead. They found a train, miraculously. Some of the train lines were still partially running, and they boarded it. Yamaguchi, his body burned and his eardrums burst, his hair gone and his mind still reeling from the incomprehensible violence he had just survived, rode the train home. He was going back to his family. He was going back to his wife and his daughter. He was going home to Nagasaki. Let that sit for a moment. He survived the first atomic bomb ever dropped on a human city, and he got on a train and went home to the city that was about to receive the second. Nagasaki sits on the western coast of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. In 1945, it was a city of about 250,000 people, an important industrial and port city that had been producing ships and weapons for the Japanese war effort. It was also one of the oldest Christian communities in Japan, a city with deep Catholic roots stretching back to Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest cathedral in East Asia at the time, stood in the heart of the city. It was, like Hiroshima, a city of ordinary people living ordinary lives inside an extraordinary and terrible war. When Yamaguchi arrived home in Nagasaki, his wife and daughter were initially horrified by his appearance. He was burned, bandaged, half-deaf, barely recognizable as the man who had left 3 months earlier on a routine business trip. He told his wife what had happened. He told her about the blinding flash, about the shockwave, about the city in ruins. His wife, like many people when first told about the bomb, struggled to fully comprehend it. The Japanese government and military were still controlling information tightly. The full truth about what had happened in Hiroshima was not yet widely understood. Some people thought it had been a massive conventional bombing raid. Others whispered about some new kind of weapon. No one outside of a very small circle of American scientists and military planners understood what an atomic bomb truly was. Yamaguchi, despite his injuries, despite his burns and his burst eardrums and his physical and psychological trauma, reported back to work. This was 1945 Japan. This was a culture that demanded endurance, duty, perseverance. You worked, you showed up, you did not surrender to weakness. And so, on the morning of August 9, 1945, just 3 days after surviving the bombing of Hiroshima, Tsutomu Yamaguchi sat in his office at Mitsubishi in Nagasaki and reported to his supervisor about the business trip. His supervisor asked him to describe what had happened in Hiroshima, and Yamaguchi, still bandaged, still half-deaf, still carrying the burns on his body, began to explain. He described the blinding light, the shockwave. The total annihilation of everything near the epicenter. The fires, the bodies, the impossible devastation wrought by a single bomb dropped from a single plane. His supervisor, hearing all of this, apparently did not believe him. One bomb, he said, one bomb could not do all of that. Yamaguchi was still explaining. He was still searching for the words to describe something that no words had ever been invented to describe. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9, 1945, the bomb called Fat Man detonated above Nagasaki. The second bomb was technically more powerful than the first. It was a plutonium bomb where Little Boy had been uranium. It yielded approximately 21 kilotons of TNT. But Nagasaki's hilly terrain actually contained some of the blast, limiting the immediate destruction compared to flat Hiroshima. That containment was cold comfort. The bomb still killed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll would rise to between 60,000 and 80,000, with many more dying in the years that followed from radiation sickness. In the Urakami district, where the bomb detonated almost directly above the cathedral, nearly every living thing was killed outright. Yamaguchi was approximately 3 kilometers from the epicenter, the same distance almost exactly as he had been in Hiroshima. The flash hit him again, the same impossible white light. The shockwave hit him again. The same force that had thrown him into a potato field 3 days earlier now threw him across his office. Once again he survived. The building protected him from the direct thermal pulse. His existing burns were not dramatically worsened. He picked himself up from the rubble of his office and for the second time in 3 days walked out of a city that had just been struck by an atomic bomb. Think about what that means for a second. Think about standing in the middle of an event that kills tens of thousands of people around you, an event of such cataclysmic violence that it changes the entire course of human history and surviving it. Then imagine doing it again, 72 hours later, in a different city, because you went home. The days that followed were chaos and horror. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, was engulfed in fire. The injured filled every available space. The medical system, already strained by years of war, collapsed completely. Radiation sickness began claiming victims who had not even been near the immediate blast zone. The familiar devastation, the rubble, the silence, the sky darkened by smoke, the dead in the streets repeated itself. Yamaguchi moved through it all again. He found his wife and daughter. They had been at home further from the epicenter and had survived. His family was alive. He was alive. Against all probability, against every calculation of survival, all 3 of them were still breathing. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation via radio broadcast. His voice had never been heard publicly before. In a message carefully worded to avoid the word surrender, he announced that Japan was accepting the terms of the Allied powers and ending the war. The war, the most destructive in human history, was over. Yamaguchi sat somewhere in the ruined city of Nagasaki and listened to the emperor's voice crackle through the radio. He had survived the beginning of the atomic age. He had survived both of its first 2 terrible announcements. He was 30 years old. What followed for Yamaguchi, as for all hibakusha, the Japanese word for atomic bomb survivors, carrying within it both the factual weight of survival and the heavy cultural and social stigma that came with it, was a long and complicated life. He suffered from the effects of radiation exposure for years. He lost his hair. He experienced recurring health problems, like many hibakusha. He faced discrimination and social stigma in post-war Japan, where many people superstitiously feared that atomic bomb survivors were contagious or cursed. He struggled with the psychological weight of what he had seen and survived. He carried within him the faces of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bodies in the rubble, the ghost-like figures walking through the ruins with their skin hanging from their arms. For decades, Yamaguchi remained largely silent about his experiences. He was recognized by the Japanese government as a survivor of Hiroshima, but his survival of Nagasaki was not officially acknowledged for years. He went back to work for Mitsubishi. He raised children. He lived his quiet life in a country that was, slowly and then rapidly, rebuilding itself into something new. Japan's post-war economic miracle would transform it from the ruins of 1945 into one of the world's most prosperous nations within a generation. Nagasaki and Hiroshima would both be rebuilt. New buildings would rise over the scorched earth. Children would play in parks where tens of thousands had died. Life, as life always does, continued. But Yamaguchi did not forget. He could not forget. And as he aged, as the post-war decades stretched into the latter half of the 20th century and then into the 21st, he began to feel a deepening urgency to speak. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were aging. Their first-hand memories of the bombs were disappearing, one funeral at a time. And in a world that still possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, a world where the Cold War had threatened for decades to reprise the terror of August 1945 on a global scale, Yamaguchi felt the pull of obligation. He had survived 2 atomic bombs. He had a responsibility to say what that meant. In his later years, Tsutomu Yamaguchi became an outspoken advocate for nuclear disarmament. He gave interviews. He spoke to journalists, to schoolchildren, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. He wrote a memoir. He participated in documentary films. He appeared before the United Nations. He became, in the final years of his life, one of the most powerful living voices for a world without nuclear weapons. He did not speak from abstraction or ideology. He spoke from the absolute, unbearable bodily knowledge of what those weapons do to human beings. He had felt the heat of 2 atomic bombs on his skin. He had breathed the air of 2 cities in the immediate aftermath of nuclear annihilation. He had walked through the rubble of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and seen, with his own eyes, what happens when humanity's most destructive technology is turned against cities full of ordinary people. It was not until January 2009 that the Japanese government officially recognized Tsutomu Yamaguchi as a Niju Hibakusha, a double atomic bomb survivor. He was the only person ever to receive this official designation. There were others who survived both bombings. Estimates suggest as many as a few dozen people may have been in both cities, but Yamaguchi was the only one formally recognized by the government as a survivor of both. The official recognition came late in his life, but it came. He was 93 years old when it was granted. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010. He was 93 years old. He died not of radiation burns or blast injuries but of stomach cancer, though whether that cancer was connected to his double radiation exposure is something that, like so much of the atomic bomb story, lives in the murky territory between what we know and what we can never fully know. He died surrounded by his family in the city of Nagasaki, in the country that had rebuilt itself from ashes into something extraordinary. He died as the last officially recognized survivor of both atomic bombings, the singular human witness to both chapters of the atomic age's terrible opening. When you try to hold Yamaguchi's story in your mind and understand it fully, you keep running into its sheer improbability. The distances were almost identical: 3 kilometers in Hiroshima, roughly 3 kilometers in Nagasaki. The timing was almost symmetrical, August 6th and August 9th, 72 hours apart. He was not hiding, he was not in a bunker, he was not behind meters of reinforced concrete. He was in an office, doing his job, reporting on his business trip when the second bomb fell. He had survived the first and traveled straight into the path of the second without knowing it, without any way of knowing it, because no one outside of Los Alamos and the upper reaches of the American military command knew that a second bomb was coming, let alone where it would fall. But here is what I want you to think about, beyond the statistics and the distances and the staggering improbability of it all. Yamaguchi's story is not just a survival story. It is not just the world's most extraordinary piece of bad timing or good timing, depending on how you look at it. His story is the story of what nuclear weapons actually are, not the abstract megatonnage, not the geopolitical calculus, not the acronyms and the policy papers and the deterrence theory. The actual thing, the burning, the shockwave, the city that was a city in the morning and a ruin by noon. The people walking through the rubble with their skin falling away, the silence where there had been hundreds of thousands of voices. Yamaguchi knew that silence. He had stood in it twice, and for the last years of his long and improbable life he dedicated himself to making sure that the rest of us understood what that silence meant. He looked into cameras and told the truth about what an atomic bomb feels like when it detonates 3 kilometers from your body. He spoke about the flash of light and the shockwave and the impossible heat and the long, slow devastation that followed. He spoke about the dead. He spoke because he was still alive when so many others were not, and because being alive carried, for him, a weight of obligation that he could not and did not set down until the very end. There's a concept in Japanese called ikigai, a reason for being, a purpose that gets you out of bed in the morning, a meaning that gives shape and direction to life. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, after surviving 2 atomic bombs and watching his country rebuild from the ruins of the worst war in human history, his ikigai became testimony, bearing witness, saying, "I was there, I saw it, this is what it was, this is what it means, do not forget, do not let this happen again." He survived 2 atomic bombs and lived to 93. He saw his city rebuilt, he saw his country transformed, he saw the Cold War begin and end, he saw the world come more than once to the edge of nuclear catastrophe and pull back, and through all of it he remembered Hiroshima, he remembered Nagasaki, he remembered the blinding light and the shockwave and the long walk through the ruins of the world he had known. He carried it with him every day, and he made sure for as long as he had breath left in his body that we would carry it too. That is Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived 2 atomic bombs, the man who should have died twice and instead lived long enough to tell the world what surviving the unthinkable actually means. Remember his name.